Hello and welcome, dear students. Today our topic for discussion is nation state, historical evolution in the Western European context. The broad objectives of the topic are: number 1, understand the terms like nation, state and nation state. 2, examine the early fragmented political order of the medieval Europe. 3, explore the early foundations of the modern nation state. 4, analyzing the linkage between sovereignty and nation state, and finally, the rise of democracy and modern nation state. So, we will begin with a brief discussion on terminology. Dear students, like so many concepts, institutions, systems and processes that can and need to be studied in a comparative perspective across time and space, the concept and institution of nation state has also been studied in a comparative perspective in terms of its evolution, its different stages, its nature, formation, working and so on. So, it is in this perspective that we will be discussing the historical evolution of nation state in Western Europe. Dear friends, the present day layout of the world's political map is a product of an endless process of politico-geographic accommodations and adjustments that the humanity has gone through. A mosaic of around 200 states and territories separated by borders and boundaries make the world look like a jigsaw puzzle. Human territoriality refers to a country's, or more locally a community's, sense of property and attachment towards its territory, expressed by its determination to keep it inviolable and defend it. The most significant political unit of the modern world is generally referred to as state or nation state. It is within and between states that contemporary political business is carried out. Being the primary unit in the study of international relations as well as in comparative politics, the nation state combines two parent or basic terms, that is nation and state. Thus, it is important to first have some understanding of these terms. In common language, nation refers to the population within a given territory sharing a common culture, language and ethnicity with a strong historical continuity. This manifests itself among the members in the form of a sentiment or collective common identity. Accordingly, the idea of people within a territory connected to each other and the nation is called nationalism. Or in other words, it is a sense of belongingness of a group of people towards each other and towards territory they inhabit and control. On the other hand, a state is a politically organized territory administered by a government and recognized by the international community. Other characteristics are a permanent population, an organized economy and a functioning internal circulation system, that is the infrastructure. When used for the formally independent political units, the term country and state are interchangeable. Theoretically speaking, a nation state signifies a recognized country possessing formal sovereignty and inhabited by a people who see themselves as a single united nation and having emotional attachment with the territorial unit. Practically, however, this is not found commonly, as it is very difficult to have a purely homogenized society. Few countries like Iceland, Portugal, Denmark and Poland are often cited as examples of classic European nation states, and this is even more uncommon outside Europe. Therefore, in general discussion, a nation state is variously called a country, a nation or a state, but technically it is a specific form of sovereign state, that is a political entity on a territory that is guided by a nation, that is a cultural entity, and which derives its legitimacy from its citizens. In general, scholars define nation state as a sovereign state of which most of the citizens or subjects are united also by factors which define a nation, such as language or common descent. To put it simply, nation state implies that a state and a nation coincide. It is important to remember that there could be nations without a state as well. Dear students, the idea of nation state is associated with the rise of modern system of states that generally speaking dates back to the Treaty of Westphalia 1648. Today, the nation states are the most powerful political actors in the world. This modern nation state system began in Western Europe and would eventually spread across the globe. Today, there are about 195 nation states, and these states comprise the major political actors on the world stage. But this was not the case always. The rise of nation state system has passed through different phases before it gained its current form. Hence, the important question is, where did the idea of nation state come from and how it evolved to its present position? So, let us now discuss in detail the historical evolution of nation state in Western European context. We will start with the medieval Europe's fragmented political system. Dear students, the roots of modern state system lie in the geographical territory that we know as Europe. As famous political scientist David Held pointed out, and I quote, "The story of formation of the modern state is in part the story of formation of the Europe and vice versa," unquote. From Europe, this system spread to the rest of the world through colonialism. Colin Hay and Michael Lister, in their work titled "The State, Theories and Issues," published in 2006, very aptly pointed out that if the origins of the state itself lie in the Mesopotamia, then it is the Western Europe that we must turn if we are to establish the origins of the modern state. Similarly, Thomas Earthman writes that though the first examples of the state building in the widest sense may have occurred more than 4,000 years ago in the ancient Near East and China, it was post-Roman state building in Western Europe lasting from about 5th century until the end of Napoleonic period that brought forth the modern state with a modern bureaucratic infrastructure at its heart. What needs to be underlined is that Europe itself was created through a combination of multiple factors. It was not naturally unified entity and instead went through different pulls and pressures. As Charles Tilly argues, 1,000 years ago, Europe as such did not exist. A decade before the millennium, that is 990 AD, there were roughly 30 million people who lived at the western end of the Eurasian landmass had no compelling reason to think of themselves as a single set of people connected by history and fate. So, there was neither any common identity nor any unified authority. Sovereignty as such was fragmented and divided. The various emperors, kings, princes, dukes, caliphs, sultans and other potentates of AD 990 prevailed as conquerors, tribute takers and so on, and not as heads of state that durably and densely regulated life within their realms. Hence, there were multiple principalities and city-states. There was a constant struggle for power among them as there were overlapping jurisdictions. There was frequent use of violence by private armies. There was no centralized national state anywhere in Europe. Although most of the Italian peninsula was claimed by the Byzantine Emperor and the Holy Roman Emperor, however, every city inside the Italian peninsula was in reality ruled by their own local political agents. Hence, in AD 1200, the Italian peninsula alone hosted 200 or 300 distinct city-states. Between the 8th and 14th century, the landmass of Europe was dominated by divided and fragmentary authority, and this period is referred to as the era of feudalism. The economy at this time was primarily based on agriculture. In the absence of any centralized political power, there used to be a constant battle to take or own whatever surplus was generated through agrarian economy. This era also started seeing the emergence of many urban centers which gave rise to the manufacturing and trade. Examples of such urban centers were Florence, Venice and Siena. Even though hundreds of such small urban centers developed throughout Europe, the political power still remained fragmented and more focused on the local power centers spread throughout the rural countryside. Some amount of unity began to be provided by the papacy, that is the office and jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome and Pope, and the Holy Roman Emperor with its overarching call for unity on the basis of religion. In the words of David Held, the Holy Roman Emperor existed in some form from the 8th until the early 19th century. At its height, it represented an attempt under the patronage of Catholic Church to unite and centralize the fragmented power centers of Western Christendom into a politically unified Christian empire. The areas under this domain were supposed to be located from Germany to Spain and from northern France to Italy. Such an order has been termed by leading international relations scholars Hadley Bull and Paul Kennedy as the International Christian Society. However, throughout the Middle Ages, there was a constant struggle for power between the Catholic Church and the local level feudal power centers in rural hinterland and numerous city-states, thus defying any long-term unified system. Now, dear students, let us examine the early foundations or initial steps towards the nation state. Dear students, the challenge to the International Christian Society about which we just talked, that was trying to provide an overarching unity to the fragmentary nature of the political authority in Europe, came in the form of Reformation at the beginning of the 16th century. Also known as the Protestant Reformation, this movement challenged the religious power of the Pope and the Catholic Church. One of its main leaders was Martin Luther, who, with the publication of a list titled as 95 Theses in the year 1517, exposed what he regarded as the abusive practices of the Church. These discriminatory practices included selling or commercializing indulgences to people, promising them to rid them of their sins and guilt. Due to the challenge posed by Reformation, the religious power and political hold of papacy was greatly reduced. This directly led to the opening up of space for new forms of political power to rise. With this, ground was created for the development of a new form of political identity, that is, the national identity. This can be termed as the first stage in the rise of modern nation state. Two different forms of political regimes started developing from the 15th to the 18th century in Europe. These were the absolute monarchies in France, Persia, Austria, Spain and Russia, and the constitutional monarchies and republics that could be found in England and Holland. Absolutism basically meant the development of an all-powerful bigger state created by engulfing or absorbing the smaller and weaker territories into its larger structural ambit. This ensured that there was a bigger unified territory with a common system of law and order. This was to be led by a single unitary sovereign head, which came to be known as the absolutist monarch. Political authority hence became completely centralized in the monarch based on the theory of divine rights of the king. This meant that the absolutist powers of the monarch or king were justified on the ground that he derived his powers directly from God and therefore could not be questioned. The increased power of monarch led to the development of a newly centralized administrative system involving a permanent bureaucracy and an army. Hence, absolutism of the monarch led to a process of uniformity in terms of administration, law and order, economy and society across the territory. Therefore, within these territories, the variations, be that political, administrative, economic, cultural and so on, started to decrease. But at the same time, these variations or differences were increasing among the territories controlled by different monarchs. David Held writes that 6 ensuing developments were of great significance in the history of state system. These were the growing coincidence of territorial boundaries with a uniform system of rule, the creation of new mechanism of lawmaking and enforcement, the centralization of administrative power, the alteration and extension of fiscal management, the formalization of relations among states through the development of diplomacy and diplomatic institutions, and finally, the introduction of a standing army. Thus, the formation of absolute monarchies became the basis for further development of the state system in Western Europe. The countless wars that were fought to consolidate the power of the monarch in his territory ultimately led to the redrawing of the map of Europe several times. However, this ensured that the territorial consolidation became a prime motive, thereby establishing the principle of sovereignty among the various monarchs. Hence, absolutism and the interstate system it initiated were the proximate sources of the modern state. Dear students, the other very important element in this discussion is the question of sovereignty and nation state. Dear friends, the factors like feudalism, church's decline and the rise of bourgeois class set the stage for the rise of powerful monarchs and with it the modern nation state system. If at all the nation state system had a birthday year, it would have been 1648, the year of the Treaty of Westphalia, which effectively brought an end to the 30 Years' War that was fought between 1618 and 1648. The 30 Years' War had been a bloody religious war between the Catholics and Protestants. As a resolution to the war, the Treaty of Westphalia allowed the German princes to decide the official religion of their domain, be that Catholic, Calvinist or Lutheran, and more importantly, throughout Europe, Westphalia signaled the beginning of state sovereignty, meaning thereby that each of these kings would be the sole sovereign in his domain. Sovereignty in general is that power of which there is no higher appeal. While the general understanding was that God was the sovereign and that rulers governed as God's ministers, however, there were attempts made by some people to sever government from the domain of heaven. One such effort was that of English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. In his work Leviathan, published in 1651, Hobbes lays the foundation of a ruler that is not merely a shadow representative of God or just an implementer of God's will, but is the absolute ruler in his domain. According to political theorist Walter Burns, Hobbes was the first political philosopher to argue openly that government may be founded on an anti-religious basis. Dear friends, Hobbes was born in 1588 the time when Spain was sailing its invincible armada to the shores of England to place the island nation under Rome and Popery. Hobbes tells the story that his mother, upon hearing that Spain's armada was about to attack England, had gone into premature labor and gave birth to Hobbes. On the day of his birth, says Hobbes, my mother gave birth to twins, myself and fear. Hobbes' absolute state originates from fear, a fear of chaos and disorder where life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. Therefore, individuals' only recourse is to surrender his natural rights to an absolute monarch that will protect him from chaos, and individuals must obey him absolutely. Hobbes' prescribed monarch was an absolute ruler who imposed order in top-down fashion under his domain. While others like John Locke modified Hobbes' theory of an absolute monarch, however, Hobbes still helped lay the foundation for a modern state by advancing the concept of a monarch above whom there was no higher appeal. Today, sovereignty is a central concept of a nation state. However, democratic states tend not to argue that the ruler is sovereign. On the contrary, sovereignty might reside either in the legislature, as in the case of United Kingdom, or in the people, as in case of countries like United States, India and so on. In due course, with the rise of notion of popular sovereignty, there was a push for accountability of rulers and democratic governance. Importantly, the concept of sovereignty underlined the foundation of a modern nation state, which was an impersonal structure of governance. Now, dear students, let us briefly discuss the issue of formation of modern nation state and the rise of democracy. It is argued that the development of modern state and its evolution into a representative liberal democracy in Western Europe was a result of many factors and processes. David Held has outlined three macro patterns: A. War and militarism, B. The emergence of capitalism, and C. The struggle for citizenship. Held posits that the nation state went on to become the dominant form of political existence on an international level because of these three temporally long drawn and complex processes. First, with regard to the role of war and militarism, it is being asserted that the modern state was initially intended for the purpose of war making in order to establish and maintain its might. This war making in return played a role in further strengthening the structures and processes of the modern state itself. In this regard, Charles Tilly has argued that the agents of the state carry on four different activities. These are: first, war making, that is eliminating or neutralizing their own rivals outside the territories in which they have clear and continuous priorities as wielders of force. Second, state making, that is eliminating or neutralizing their rivals inside those territories. Third, protection, that is eliminating or neutralizing the enemy of their clients. And fourth, extraction, that is acquiring the means to carry out the first three activities, that is war making, state making and protection. Hence, many state makers were locked into an open-ended and ruthless competition in which, as Tilly would put it, most contenders lost. The successful cases of state making such as Britain, France, Spain, etc. were the survivors. Secondly, with regard to relationship between capitalism and formation of the modern state, David Held has posited that modern states were economically successful because of the rapid growth of their markets from the late 16th century and particularly after the mid 18th century. The sustained process of capital accumulation helped in the expansion of the economic base of the centralized state. And this in turn reduced the war-making capacities of other smaller states with fragmented political structures or the ones that relied on more traditional forms of coercive power. David Held also underlined that after the decline of the Muslim world, which had dominated the worldwide trade relations around AD 1000, it was Europe that burst forth outward towards the world. The states of Europe were helped in their endeavor by their military and strong naval forces. And dear students, these developments furthered the process of colonizing the rest of the world. The Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, British and French scrambled for colonies in Asia and Africa. Increases in the resources of Europe by draining the wealth of colonies further strengthened their own system. In particular, European expansion became a major source of development of state activity and efficiency. In the later stage, the growth of interconnections between states and societies, that is, growth of globalization, became progressively shaped by the expansion of Europe. Globalization initially meant European globalization. Third, concerning the struggle for citizenship and the rise of liberal democracy, David Held highlights three reasons as to why citizenship crystallized in many Western polities in the form of civil and political rights, ultimately leading to the rise of the liberal democratic modern nation state. These are, first, the reciprocity of power, where national governments came to be dependent on the cooperation of the population, especially in times of emergencies like wars. Second was the weakening of the traditional forms of legitimacy based particularly on religion and property rights. This led to alternative notions of legitimacy of the political authority based on a reciprocal relationship between the governors and the governed. And thirdly, the liberal representative democracy did not threaten the growing autonomy of the civil and economic society. These three reasons collaborated to the ultimate development of the liberal democratic state. However, the path was long drawn and many battles had to be won by different groups of people. For example, women had to struggle hard for their basic rights in almost all parts of the world, be it East or the West. Women were granted voting rights in France in 1944 and in Britain in 1928. From the pursuit of no taxation without representation in the 17th century England to the diverse struggles to achieve a genuinely universal franchise in the 19th and 20th centuries, advocates of greater accountability in government have sought to establish satisfactory means of choosing, authorizing and controlling political decisions. And out of this extremely long and complex process emerged the modern nation state. So, dear students, to conclude, different types of socio-political communities have emerged at different times and places throughout the history. These range from tribal groups, agricultural communities, nomadic groups, empires, kingdoms, vassal states and so on. Some of these organizations have been centralized and powerful, while others have been loosely organized or decentralized. The modern nation state as a political community is one of the most recent forms of human institutions. It is one of the most important players at the international as well as domestic stage. While it had been thought that with the creation of international organizations like United Nations and European Union, the nation state system would collapse just as did the feudal order from which the Westphalian system sprung. However, this has not happened. The nation states still remain the most powerful political players on the international stage. In order to explore the rise and evolution of the modern nation state, it needs to be understood in terms of its long drawn out and uneven process situated in Western Europe. It needs to be understood against the backdrop of the breakup of medieval world, which was a place of divided and overlapping authority and religious conflicts. Certain developments led to the change in this context. These developments include the Reformation, the rise of international capital, trade and European expansion through colonialism, the rise of absolutist monarchies, and the theoretical discourse on sovereignty. These became the foundations that led to the development of modern nation states. Nation states have themselves evolved from monarchical forms to that of liberal representative democracies. So, dear friends, that is all for today. I hope, dear students, you would have enjoyed this lecture. Goodbye and take care.